Okay, so welcome to today's ASP.NET Core Study Group. We are on week 9 today. So I'm going to talk about model binding and validation, select list validation at Singleton, at Scoped versus at Transient. Okay, so last week, if you were here, so we presented, Thomas presented routing. Okay, so if you are not familiar, you can go back to that video to revise on routing. And so what is ASP.NET Core model binding? Model binding maps data in a HTTP request to the controller action methods parameters. And these action parameters can be either simple types like integers, strings, etc., or complex types like customer, employee, order, etc. Let me show you some code. So this is our employee management ASP.NET. It looks something like this, where we list out some hard-coded employee details. That looks something like this. So this is on the home page, we list out the list of employees. We have Mary, John, and Sam, 3 employees. And let's say we go to the detail of Mary. We go to view. So home/details/1 gives us the details of employee ID number 1, whose name is Mary. You can see the ID here, the email address, and the department. Let's say I go to 2. So we are showing John and John's email and John's department. So this is what we talked about last week about routing. And if you remember, I'll show you in the startup class. Okay, we have in the configure method, we use MVC and defining the route. We map the route to say the default route is home controller, index, and ID. And in this kind of format. Okay, so the first one is the controller / the action / the ID. So let's go back to have a look. So sorry, this is not the one. Okay, so / home is a controller, / details is the action, and 2, the last one is the ID. Okay, I'll show you again. Controller, action, ID. So ID is the parameter that maps in the action method. So let's have a look at home controller. If you go to our controllers, home controller, and we go to details action, and we see there is one parameter which is an integer by the name of ID. Okay, so when you look at, I'm sorry, this /2, this one directly maps to the ID. Okay, the ID here directly maps there. So if I put 3 goes in here, and we use the employee repository to get ID number 3 and return the view employees details with employee details for ID 3. Okay, so this is called simple type model binding. I repeat, model binding maps the data in the HTTP request, okay, to the controller action here, and the parameters here. So the parameters can be integer, string, which are the simple type, or the more complex type, customer and employee. All right, so any questions so far? You can stop me if you have question. If no question, yeah, any question?
No, I think good.
Okay, thank you. So let us explore passing as parameter a complex type like okay, sorry. Let me first talk about passing additional parameters, okay? So let me try to stop if I can get rid of that. Okay. So a second example is having the details method returning a string, okay? So the same way we have ID, integer, and the second parameter we have name. And this time we don't return the nice view that we have constructed, but we just return a string just to demonstrate what it's like. All right, so let me go to the details view. And now we have, okay, we have ID equals to 1 value to string, and the name, which is empty because we didn't pass in any name parameter. So it is empty. All right, let me pass in the name parameter by using the question mark, name equals to Jane. And you can see Jane being populated as the name. All right, so what this illustrate to us is that, let me put this higher, is that the parameter name here matches exactly here and pass in the value into the action details. If I mistype the name, let's say name X, then it doesn't get passed in to this name parameter. So this one becomes empty because we didn't pass in the name. Let me correct that and pass in name, and you can see it is passed in here as a value. What about if I pass in parameter ID equals to 2? Okay, you can see that ID is still 1, name is Jane. Okay, why is that? So name Jane is passing here, but 1 as an ID is taken from the route. Okay, the route has a precedence over the parameter here. So that's why ID 2 at the back is being ignored because we have already populated ID equals to 1 in the route. Let's say I don't want to use the route. Let's say I just pass in name equals to Jane, ID equals to 2 into the details action. So here you can see ID equals to 2 is reflected here and name Jane is reflected here. So for example, if I put in Robert and ID 4, it will show ID 4 here and name here. Okay, any questions so far about this routing and model binding with simple types? Yeah. Okay, so let me go on to the next bit, which is model binding using complex type. So this was just a demonstration. So let me return it back to this one. Okay. So for complex model binding, we can have something like this. Sorry, let me just demonstrate to you what create actually looks like at the moment. So I have in the view a create HTML, and so as you can remember, the default routing means the action from home/create will come to here and return the view that matches the name. Okay, I can see maybe there's a question. Hi, Akit, welcome. So I'm now just describing complex model binding. Let me show you what create looks like. Bear with me, my IIS is a little bit slow when I'm presenting. Okay, so I have also created this create here in the layout. Later I can show you. Okay, in fact, I'll show you now. If you go to layout here, I have list item, home, create, and privacy. For home, it's mapped to action index. For create, action create, and privacy is privacy. And all these are specified in the controller. We have create, index, and privacy. So let's have a look at create. Oops, wrong window again. Okay, it's a little bit big. Let me go back to normal. All right. So if I go to create, it looks something like this. I have name, a text box, email, a text box, and department, which is a drop down. Okay. So if I go to /home/create, basically it just returns this view, okay, which is the create view CS HTML. So what if I bind? Let me bind this to a complex type, which is employee type. Okay, it's saying that I need to stop and recompile. All right, so instead of passing simple type, I'm now passing a complex type, which is employee, type employee. And what do I want to do when I create an employee? I want to add the employee into the employee repository, which is passed in as a singleton in the constructor. This is the constructor of home controller. You can ignore the logger, actually we're not using it. Employee repository is passed in here, which was defined in startup as a singleton. Services at singleton in the configure services, a mock employee repository. All right. So this has been covered in previous videos, so I won't go into the detail. And here, I want to add employee into the repository, but so far we haven't done that. So let me go and create the add method in the I repository, which is just taking an employee object and returning the added employee. And in my mock employee repository, I have to implement it. Okay, so when I hover over the squiggle red line, I employee repository, it complains that I haven't implemented the new method add employee. So I can just click on the light bulb and say implement the interface, and I get these generated code for me to say I need to, oh, I'm sorry, it's over here. It's highlighted over here, add the employee. So what I want to do here is to say employee dot. Okay, first I add it to the employee list dot add employee, and I return this employee back to the calling function. But because we pass in the form the name and the email and HR, we are missing the ID. You can see the mock employee contains ID, name, department, and email. So the ID, usually we will auto increment this value here. So what we do is employee.id equals to the list.max max ID, okay, plus 1. All right. So all this does is I take the employee information that has been passed in to me. I set the ID to be the maximum of these plus 1, and I add it to the list and return. All right. Let me go back to home controller. And so what I do is I call add with the employee passed in as a complex type to the repository and get the returned new employee. And here is redirect to action. Okay. You can see redirect to action. It has the action name, it expects the action name, controller name, and route values. So action name, I'm sorry, this is just 2 parameters. So let me see, details and the value. Okay, action name and the value. So what I do is with the new employee, I want to go to details. I want to show it, and I want to show it with the employee ID. Okay. And because this one returns redirect to action result, I put the return type as redirect to action result. So if I run this, and I browse to create, here, you will see an error. It says multiple actions match because we have create twice and the route is confused. Which one should I go to? So what we have to do is we have to specify the route using the attribute HTTP post. And let's say if you're not giving it any data, it's HTTP get. All right, so this is a default. When we don't pass in any data, we get the view. And when we are passing data using post, we will come to this action. Okay. So let me go to create. And this one, because I'm not passing in anything, it's just a get. It will come to here to create a view. And let me put in some details. I'm going to say Jane and email address. I'm going to say IT, create. This is a post method, HTTP post. It goes into here, creates the employee into the list and return details action. So now we are redirected to details with the new employee ID number 4, which we have incremented. And this is the details. Okay, employee 4. And if you look at the list, you have 4 employees now. So this is how we bind using complex type in the create view. Let's say I create another one, Jonathan X, and I say he's in HR, and it goes to details with 5 pass in as the ID. And you can see now we have 5 employees. Because this is all in the mock data, once we restart the program, it will start with just 3 again. All right. So this is model binding with complex type. Let me just recap. For model binding, there is a precedence. Model binding will first look for data in the HTTP request form values, and then route values, and lastly in the query strings. Okay. So we have done this one. Now let me go to the next topic, which is model validation. So we have created all these we can create employee using name of email and department, but sometimes we want to make sure that the values are not null. Okay, so now if you just run this, I'll let this run in the background. Okay. So how do we do this? First, we apply validation attributes on the properties. So let's say I want name to be required. I add the attribute to the class property. And these are all the valid validation attributes. Required, which I just talked about, regular expression. Range is a range of number from min to max. Minimum length, maximum length. These are related to strings. And compare. So whether it exactly matches a string or not. Okay, so first you apply the validation attributes. Then you use model state.isValid property to check whether it has passed all the validation in the action. And lastly, in your view, you can use ASP validation for each of the properties. Okay, let me demonstrate in the code. But first, let me show you that when you go to create, and if you don't fill in anything and you press create, it will actually create an empty email and name for this employee, which is not what we want. And even the name is empty. So this will cause problems to us in the future. So now we need to add the validation. So again, step 1 is to apply the attributes into the class. So I have employee class here. I want name and email to be required parameters. So I just add the attribute here. There's some squiggly. I mouse over and it says that the namespace is required. Go ahead and click on the light bulb and add the missing namespace and do the same for email. Okay, step 1 is to add the attribute, which we have done. Step 2 is in the home controller. In the create action, we want to check if model state is valid. Okay, and we put this one in here and this one as well. All right, if it is valid, we will go ahead and add the employee. into the repository. If not, we want to just return the view. Oh, I'm sorry. Return view, just like when the initial view is shown in the create, so that we go back to the form again to let the user fix the error. Okay, so here it's complaining that view result object renders a view, but this is expecting redirect to action result. So I need to change this to action result, which is a common ancestor to both redirect to action and view. Both of these are type action result. So now I don't have any error. Okay, this is step 2. And step 3 is to change in the view, in the create view, and add these tags ASP validation for. Okay, I have already done this for name, but I need to do this for email as well. Just add after the input span ASP validation for and email. This one has to match the input name. Okay, and this is how you add the ASP validation for. Okay, let me run this because I have applied all 3 steps. 1 to add attribute, 2 to add is valid in the model, and 3 is to add the HTML tags for ASP validation for. Now I go to create and I attempt to create with empty values, and now it's complaining. Name field is required, email field is required, but one is red and one is black. So how do I make it red? I use the class text danger. This is a bootstrap class that just default make it to red. So let me try that again. Oh, did I save? No. Looks like it's not refreshing, but it's okay. I'll just restart this one, and this one will become red because I have added the class text danger. So one other thing that we can add at the end is something we call, I add a div, okay. I'll close it first. And I say SP validation summary. Actually, this one can be empty. So ASP validation summary takes different kind of parameters here. All, model only, and none. So I'm going to select all. And let me restart. And this one will show you a summary inside this div of all the errors that happened in the validation. So just to recap, I have ASP validation for, and for each of the field, and ASP validation summary for all of it to be displayed at once. So now if I click create, I see email is now red here, and also a list of information here to say the summary of all the errors. So depending on how you like to present your errors, you can choose one or the other. Okay, again, this one is black. I just need to add class text danger from the Bootstrap CSS to make it red. So let me go to my slides. Okay, I've gone through this. And note that we can customize the validation by using error messages, display name, and regular expression. So let me start with regular expression. So for email address, we want to make sure that it is something something alias something something.com or in that kind of format, right? So we can put this in our email class, employee class email property. We say we want it to be required property. We also want it to match this regular expression, blah, blah, blah. So you can sort of chain the attributes one after another. And what do I have at the back here is error message. I can customize the error message here to be invalid email format, because without this one, it will just display something like email has to be in this regular expression, which is gibberish to the user, because the users is not a programmer like us. So we display a user-friendly message, say invalid email format. You can, of course, put the error message of your choice. What else can we do with the attributes? We can also put a display name. So for example, email, we actually don't want to just call it email, we want to call it office email. All right, so in the display name, display attribute, we can put in the name that you prefer. And yeah, so for example, for name, we can also have, all right, so here, because we already have required here, actually error message belongs to required. So I can just remove this and say for the required error message, I want to specify my own error message. All right. So this is all the different things you can do with the attribute in the employee properties, in the class properties. Let me just demonstrate what we have done here. We go to create. And here we say that please provide a value for the name. This is a custom message. And here, because I use display name office email, email has been replaced by office email. And here I say, it says office email field is required, which is default. But let's say I put in Jane Doe and I missed out the alias. So it is no longer a valid email format. I validate it again and it says invalid email format. Okay, here, invalid email format, which is a custom error message for the regular expression validation. Okay, so let's say everything is correct and I go ahead and press create. It will then pass the validation and enter into our list. Next, I want to show you select list validation. I'll need to go a little bit faster to catch up. So department is actually a list, which if you look at the details HTML, I am using for yeah, actually this is incorrect. Sorry, please bear with me. I'm just going to copy from my other code, which is exactly the same. Don't worry about it. Okay, in the create, I have a select for the department, and I use the helper method HTML get enum select list for department. So department is actually an enum that I have created, which has none, HR, payroll, and IT. If you mouse over none, there's a value there, which is an integer value, 0. And HR integer value is 1, payroll is 2, and IT is 3. Okay. So how do I validate this part? Let's say I want department to be also required. All right. So for this property, I say required. Okay. And in my view, I put here span ASP validation for department with the class text danger. And so I want the default value to be please select rather than none HR or IT. All right, please select. So how do I do that? The easiest way to do this is to have a default option value, which is empty, and the text here, please select. So when I run this, so what do you expect here? Because I have added the required attribute, okay? I go to create and I fill in Jane and the email address. And I don't put anything in the department. Go ahead to create. It complains that the department field is required, which is kind of what I expected. But actually, this is not using, actually, this is interesting. Let me try. So if I remove required from the attribute here, let me remove this and try again. Okay, I go to create and I fill in this information, but I leave department unselected. Oh my God, this is not what this is not what happened in the video. Oh, because I have department as string, it should be integer, right? It should be enum. Oh, that's why. I'm sorry. Department should be enum. Okay. So let me try this again. I don't have. Okay, it's complaining. No. So this one will be department.hr and this is department.it. And this is department.it. So now in the employee class, I do not have the attribute required. So it shouldn't matter that I leave it blank. Let me try. Oh, it is actually complaining. The value empty string is invalid. Why? Because when I specify in the employee that department is an enum, and enum is inherently integer type, that means that even though we don't have required tag, this is required, all right? And when I pass in empty string, it was complained that it is not valid value. So how do I actually make this an optional parameter? what we have to do is actually use the question mark. All right. Sorry, I must have the setting wrong. I need to restart every time. I'll show you. If I have the question mark for types like integer and enum, it will mean that it is optional. And if I go to create and fill in, it will say it is empty, okay? It is not complaining that it is not valid. So now I can go ahead and say, in this context, I still want it to be required, but it has to be a valid value. And run it again. Now it complains because it is automatically converting the empty string into an invalid value and say that you have not filled it in correctly. But if I put in a valid value like payroll, it will go ahead and fill it in with the correct enum. Okay, so the required attribute with enum and types like integers, enum are underlying values, integers, and they are inherently required. If you want it to be optional, use the question mark to mark them as optional. And add the required tag if you want them to be required. All right, I hope this is clear. The last section that I want to cover is Singleton, Scope, and Transient. So here, as I mentioned before, in our home controller, we are using employee repository, which is passed in as a constructor over here, which we call, I believe it is a dependency injection. Correct me if I'm wrong. And if you look at startup, in the configure services, we add this using Singleton, add Singleton. So this means that when we add, whenever we access the mock employee repository in the form of employee repository, it will use the same object that we created the first time we used this object. All right. So we are using it in the create view. We're using it in index, okay, when we list it out or out. We also use it in create, okay, when we add an employee and return the view. When we return the view, we also use employee repository. Okay, I want to show you in the return view. Okay, I'm sorry. Let me go back to create. Oh, home controller, please bear with me. All right. So okay, let's say I don't want to redirect to details. All right, I just want to return to the same view, create, and inside create, I am going to show the count at the end of everything. So I'll show you. Now we're using Singleton. Okay, here in the last div, I say total employees count is employee repository, get all employees count to string. So this employee repository, I have to inject into the view using inject, alias inject, employee repository, and the name. Okay, this is a variable name. I'm injecting this object here so that I can use it here at the end. Okay, alias inject and using it at the end. So let me demonstrate what this means. I'm sorry for overrunning a little bit. We are getting to the end. I'm just going to show you the difference between add Singleton, add scope, and add transient. So let me go to create and let me, okay, so initially in the mock repository, I have created 3 employees and I'm going to add one more, create, it becomes 4. Let me add again another person. And you can see 5. And every time I press create, it will just add different employees into the list. And in fact, if you go to home, you can see I have created many employees. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 in the end. Okay, so this is the demonstration of add singleton. So no matter where we are in the application, it is accessing the same object that we have created first time we use it. All right. The difference now, let's see. If we change in the startup, instead of add singleton, we say add scope. How does that affect it? Again, we start with 3 objects because this is a restart of the application and my mock employee repository only has 3.
Baby, yeah.
Sorry, is someone unmuted? Okay, so let me add Jane Doe again, create, we have 4. And let me press again, create. It doesn't increase. Even if I change it to James Bond. Let's say just a different email, it doesn't matter. So you can see that the total employees count always remain as 4. This is the difference for add scope because for add scope, with a scope service, we get the same instance within the scope of a HTTP request, but a new instance across different HTTP requests. So every time I press create, it's a new HTTP post. Okay, so it is going to create a new mock repository for me to add this new object into it. Okay, the last one, I'm going to show you what add transient. What add transient will give us. Let's look at the documentation. With transient service, a new service is provided every time an instance is requested, whether it is in the scope of the same request or different HTTP request. Okay, so let's demonstrate. Put in a new person. We start with 3 and it doesn't even add 1 to this. Okay, although Jane has been added in this request, when it returns, this is a different object. Okay, so no matter how many times I press, this is returning a new instance of mock employee repository. All right. And this is the summary of the differences between Singleton, Transient, and Scope for Singleton service. No matter whether you're in the scope of a, sorry, let me first. Okay. Singleton, same instance, no matter whether you are in the same scope or different request. For Transient, it's a new instance every time, whether it's the same scope or different request, you get a new instance. And for the scope service, within one HTTP request, it is the same instance. All right. So I've come to the end of my presentation today. Please unmute yourself if you have any question so far or any comments that you'd like to make. Hi, welcome, Thomas.
Thank you, Daphne.
Thanks, Joanne. I hope this is clear.
It was very helpful.
Okay,
I learned some little things that I hadn't picked up on before.
Yeah, I hope so. Thanks, Hong Tat. I guess my learnings from this is when I do a presentation, I actually learn the subject through and through. I have to recreate the sample code, make it work. And yeah, I need to make sure that I understand so that I can present. So this is the benefit of sharing. So don't be afraid. Everyone may feel nervous when you present a new topic, but don't worry about that. I am still nervous now, but the more we do, the better we get. And the good thing about it is you learn a lot deeper about a subject, right? Okay. If you don't have any question, let's finish up here. And I will share the slides and sample code in the WhatsApp group. And we can continue our discussion there. All right. Okay, thanks everyone.
Thanks. Bye.
Bye-bye.